will begin now. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our session, The Future of Theological Education, hosted by the Davenant Institute. My name is Brad Littlejohn, and I am joined here by Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things magazine, who has experience prior to that teaching at Creighton University and a number of other institutions, and so has had a lifetime of experience in and around theological education and reflecting on it. Ephraim Radner, who likewise has many decades of experience as a theological educator, currently professor of historical theology at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. And O. Allen Noble, who is the assistant professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University and is a well-known writer on many fora and very active on Twitter. Had a great article earlier this year offering a more bullish account on the future of Christian colleges and Christian higher education. So we look forward to hearing their diverse perspectives on this wide topic, which has been a matter of great interest to us at the Davenant Institute since our formation about 7 years ago. We really were founded with the mission of bridging the gap, what many people had recognized was a growing and intolerably wide gap in many places between the church and the academy. And so we've been watching with interest developments institutionally in how theological education is pursued, and many of those developments have now accelerated dramatically or have the potential to accelerate dramatically with the fallout from coronavirus this year. So it's in light of that we want to have this conversation about the current challenges facing theological education, the future prospects for it, and what some of the pros and cons are of the new institutional context that we might have for pursuing theological education. Now, before diving in, should perhaps define this topic. We could. There's so much to explore here. We could have many webinars. So we're really probably just going to scratch the surface here tonight. But just to think about when we're talking about theological education, there are several different institutional contexts that come to mind. Well, before we get to institutional context, we should say, what is theological education? Well, what is theology? Theology is, I would say, learning to speak rightly about God. And that is, I think, an important point to foreground, because for Christians, theological education cannot just be education about the discipline of theology, conceived of as an interesting branch of human study that we learn about different theories and how people have done it through history. But ultimately, theology has the purpose of bringing us into encounter with God and learning to speak rightly about Him. And so the stakes are very high. And there's both an objectivity about it, that there's sort of an absolute truth here to be pursued, which to a greater extent than other disciplines. There's also a subjectivity to a greater extent than other disciplines. Ultimately, to engage in theology is to engage in an encounter with the living God. And so it is a task of discipleship and spiritual formation and not mere education. So different contexts where theological education might take place. I think in the 20th century, we might identify 5 contexts at least that come to mind for me. One would be the Bible College, which was the kind of fundamentalist response to the lack of sort of loss of faith in the theological education that was happening in mainstream universities. And the purpose of the Bible College is it's focused on theological education, or at least a portion of theological education, and it's equipping people for preparing them for seminary perhaps, or for vocations in the church that might not require a seminary degree, youth ministry, that sort of thing. Of course, one of the weaknesses of the Bible College is that it's a Bible college. It's biblical education, but it has tended to be very thin on the other key elements of what a theological education would be. And so perhaps partly for that reason, the Bible college model, I think, has started to fade from view. And there aren't that many. There used to be many successful Bible colleges in the landscape. Many of them have morphed into second model, which would be the Christian liberal arts college, for which theological education is one purpose, but it's one purpose among others. It is a liberal arts college. It is educating Christians in many different disciplines, but necessarily, if it is a Christian college, theological education is part of what it does. And of course, the challenge there has been in the higher education marketplace with well, I don't need to go into all the challenges. I'm going to ask you to speak the challenges in a moment. But arguably, theological education has gotten squeezed out increasingly, and Christian liberal arts colleges have to do so many other things to satisfy their customers that how much actual theological education happens there. The other three, I'll just say briefly. There's of course the seminary comes to mind. The seminary is not merely a vehicle for theological education. It is for pastoral formation, for training pastors for the work of ministry, which obviously includes theological education, but also includes other skills. There's the divinity school, which historically did that, trained pastors, but was also a place for higher level research for training theologians who would themselves be future teachers of pastors, and some of whom would be scholars. And of course, the challenge there has been that so many divinity schools, as they've been sort of sucked into the priorities of the modern university, have ceased to be able to use theology as an opportunity to speak about God, and they study theology as any other human discipline. And so many divinity schools no longer were reliable places to actually study theology in an orthodox way. And so many of them have morphed into what is perhaps a fifth mode of theological education, which would be the Department of Religious Studies, the Department of Religion at a university, in which, again, theological education has now become an education about theology, but not truly an education in theology, not an attempt to seek the face of God. So I guess want to start with asking Ephraim. First, do you think that are there other current institutional contexts that you would say of theological education that don't fit into those five that I haven't mentioned? And what would you say is, properly speaking, in your view, the core goals of theological education?
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the helpful outline. One, I'm sure there's more than one, but one type of theological education that is long-standing, so it's quite traditional, but is still going on, although it's not viewed necessarily as a central format, is the kind of education that traditionally associated with religious communities, in which studia and otherwise, in which either members or novices or others who come together and live together, and they're actually sort of siphoned off for their particular theological formation as in one part of the community, in a different location from the community. I've seen some of these. As I say, some of them are called studia, or a studium, or someplace where you live together. So it's like a seminary, except the point is it's an extension of a community. You don't go to the seminary so that you can join a community. You join a community, which allows you then theological formation. It's a very different ordering. So as I say, these things go on. I've seen them, and it isn't just in Catholic context where this happens. There are Protestant versions of this as well, but definitely a minority. Definitely a minority. And why? Because it demands, in the first instance, an utter commitment to a life with others in Christian community and service and sharing of life and so on. And we live in the West in a place where basically theological education of any of these kinds is something that you choose to do out of your individual realm of individual optionalities. So, however Christian they may be, nonetheless, it's a self-initiated kind of thing that you go to do. Let me just say quickly something. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying that raises an interesting question. I want to ask you: so the formation of community and being the benefits of community and being formed in a community are obviously one of the blessings that can go along with being part of many different education institutions. Would you say, is this would you say this is integral to what it means to pursue theological education?
Yes,
That
I
life
would.
in community?
I would, without any question.
Okay.
It's not to say that there aren't other ways to do it that are valid and necessary, but I would say they ought to be secondary and ancillary to the main way of doing it. Let me just say quickly something about what I think theology is and why, therefore, this sort of, it grows out of the Christian church rather than feeding into the Christian church. In theology, I have a colleague, Joseph Mangina. He says theologians are the last Renaissance person there are. They're meant to be immersed and knowledgeable in Scripture and classical theological writers, but also philosophy and history and aesthetics and music, and you go on and on and on, right?
Theology is queen of the sciences.
And the sciences themselves, and what we would call the natural sciences as well, right? I think I've read, people claim the last time there was anybody who knew everything was the 17th century. People like Leibniz or maybe Athanasius Kirk or the Jesuit, the last person to know everything. Now, a theologian isn't supposed to know everything, but because, as you said, theology is reasoning, speech, knowledge about God, and in the face of God, God is the creator of all things. Knowledge and engagement with God is about the comprehensive nature of God's embrace and ordering of reality. And of course, it's by God's word that happens. So obviously Scripture is a lens, but it's a lens into everything. So the comprehensiveness of what theology is bears no comparison to any other realm. I like to say theology is really, to use a word coined only in the 17th century, pantology. That's to say, it's meant to be about everything. If Christ is the pantocrator, theology is pantology, pantologia. Now, that nobody can, but that's the basis upon which theology is entered into and pursued. And to do that, you have to have scope, you have to have time, you have to have stability. One could go on and on about these things, of which the church, the people of God, represents the sort of the image of what that is. So theology comes out of the body of Christ, who is the great pantologist of all. I think that the pressures in theological education, and obviously if you're a minister, you're not aiming to spend your time doing it, but you ought to be growing out of that, whatever kind of ministry you do. The pressures against theology as pantology in our era is precisely organizing it in as usable a form as possible, which is also as constrained and as disposable, etc., as any other usable element in our culture. And everything works against the pantological framework of theological, of the theological reality. Everything in our culture does. So you asked me, what do I think this issue of sort of the communal life? Absolutely. Once that became the exception, which it is now, it was simply, that's not the cause of it, but it was simply a sign that the Rubicon had been crossed and theology had become something else. Very much so. Anyway, I'll stop.
So if I understand the connection there, what you're saying is precisely because no one person is capable, especially in the sort of state of modern academic study, of that pantology. That is why theology has to be pursued in community, so that my knowledge is limited, but my knowledge is augmented. My knowledge is a piece of the knowledge of the community, and there's a shared knowledge.
You are part of the enfolded life of the body of Christ. And, what we get at best today are dilettantes. I'm a dilettante. I make no bones about it.
Oh, no, I'm more of a dilettante than you.
Oh, okay. Well, we can fight who's the biggest dilettante. But, a smattering of this and that, and you can sound really smart because you know some opera and you also know baseball and you've learned a little foreign language and whatever. And of course we can't, as you say. We cannot be pantologists ourselves. But that's a vocation. That's a vocation, and it's a real one. And so however that can be pursued ought to be the way we conceive of framing theological education for everybody. Whether you're a youth minister or not, you have to be pulled into the great pantological current of the Christian life in church. And I just think nobody has much interest in this anymore. And there are reasons for it. It's not because people are stupid or they're bad or mean, but there are a lot of constraints on our ability to do that we have sort of accepted. And I think we should not accept them. We should find ways to engage them.
Well, I think
go ahead.
Yeah, theology is paradoxical in the sense that it has a very concrete focus, biblical, and ultimately the language and practice of the church has truth revealing power. And so you immerse yourself ever more deeply in the Christian tradition, and that actually opens you to this pantological, as Ephraim uses the term, vision. So that Christ has truth revealing power, and that you can see the world more fully and more comprehensively insofar as you see it through the lenses of the Christian language. Paradigmatically biblical, but not exclusively biblical, because we inherit through the church a ramified language about all manner of things. And I think we live in a time when we assume that we have to use abstract concepts in order to speak most broadly about reality, when in fact, I think the promise of Christian theology is that as we speak concretely in Christian terms, we can actually grasp the fuller sweep of reality.
Okay, thank you. That's very, I think, helpful and aspirational way of framing the theological task. Alan, I want to ask you: would you agree with this definition? Do you think this is too idealistic a way of framing the task of theology, perhaps, or too aspirational? If not, I think the question arises: does something like that happen at the Christian Liberal Arts College, or are we kidding ourselves when we characterize what we're doing there as a form of theological education?
Yes. So going back to what Ephraim was saying with this pantological, I'm not even a dilettante, so I'm not even going to pretend to be at that level yet. One day I'd like to be. But I'll tell you, one thing that I enjoy doing as being a part of a rich liberal arts faculty is that I feel like many of my colleagues fill in those holes. And so I don't know opera, I don't know baseball, for example. I'm not great at foreign languages, but some of my colleagues are. And what I can do is that when I teach literature, I can help my students understand how theology, how learning to speak rightly about God can be revealed and exercised, the kind of habits that they can cultivate in reading literature that brings them to understand God more richly. And part of my task then is to, in many ways as possible, make these connections to history and philosophy and political science and the sciences, so that they understand that the project that we're doing in my class, understanding contemporary literature or Dante, for example, is not some isolated field, although they might have registered for a single literature class, but it's part of this richer tradition. And when my colleagues and I are teaching well, I believe that together we're able to weave this tapestry together that does try to, at an undergraduate level, right, try to pull together these various strings and
Can I jump in and just commend that? I think a Christian liberal arts college is precisely the one place today in America where that's a relatively understood way of doing things. I absolutely agree. But the other thing you said is that's undergraduate. So
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge. There's something
Yeah.
marvelous about what goes on in a well-functioning Christian liberal arts college.
Yeah.
And how does that work elsewhere? And can it keep working?
Yeah.
So let me jump onto that phrase, a well-functioning Christian liberal arts college. The question would be, are our Christian liberal arts colleges now, and we can talk about our other institutions of theological education, seminaries, divinity schools, etc. Are they well-functioning right now? Obviously, there are many headwinds facing Christian higher education and theological education right now. Now, one way of narrating those is that these are sort of external challenges. They're not these institutions' fault. You know, there are economic pressures, whatever. There are cultural pressures. There's, of course, coronavirus coming out of the blue and making things more difficult for everyone. But others would say, no, there's some deeper issues here that these institutions bear some responsibility for. In terms of, you know, I mean, just highlighting, I think, you know, three challenges would be, of course, spiraling tuition prices. Why is this happening? And is this making the goal of education more and more out of reach for more people? Another would be the pressures toward identity politics and sort of woke virtue signaling that are taking hold at so many even more conservative Christian institutions, and making it difficult for them to, you know, in a field like literature, to sort of teach the Western canon in anything like a traditional way. Another issue would be, of course, the, you know, Ephraim talks about this pantology, this aspiration to be able to speak of the whole of reality. And one of the problems, it seems to me, that every institution, from college and seminary and graduate schools, they all face a problem of that what's coming in, the students that are coming in are much less fully formed than some of these institutions were originally designed for, in terms of, you know, I mean, seminaries used to be able to count on students coming in already knowing perhaps Latin and Greek, and colleges, I mean, we're going a ways back, you know, colleges used to be able to count on perhaps people already knowing Latin coming into college. So students are coming in with so little grasp of the things that used to be taken for granted that these institutions really, colleges are doing remedial work, seminaries are getting students with very little background formation, and so the goals keep dropping as the sort of quality of incoming student is dropping. Do you think, is this a fair, I'll invite any of you to comment, is that a fair characterization of some of the headwinds facing theological education right now? And what are some other headwinds that you would say are out there, like even before coronavirus?
Well, I mean, the preparation of students, I think from time immemorial, professors have complained about poorly prepared students. So I'll set that aside. I would draw attention instead to some remarks that Pope Benedict made when he gave a speech at Regensburg. And it was his observation that the faculty, when he was on faculty, there was a sense of responsibility of all faculty members to try to seek some larger synthetic truth. They had their expertise and their disciplines, but they felt the duty to venture beyond the safety of their discipline to try to engage questions, however haltingly, in a more synthetic way. And I think we live in a time where we trust that kind of these individual zones of expertise will provide us collectively with enough technical knowledge that our complex societies can function, and that no one needs to try to synthesize a sense of the whole. And I think that may in fact be a unique contribution of Christianity, which is that it's not just, I mean, that we as, you know, as followers of Christ, as those who believe in Christ, we participate in the synthetic power of his truth. And if you have an intellectual vocation, you should seek to manifest that synthetic power in your own understanding. So I think we live in a time where that synthetic ambition is just, it's not non-existent, but it's much weaker than it was at a time when Christianity had a stronger influence on our intellectual culture.
I think that's right. And we could go into the issue of how specializations and how that's understood in modern academics has had a very baneful influence on all of this. The issue of how one encourages synthetic thinking or the truth is really important. And I think, Alan said earlier, I can't do this, my colleague can do this, and so on and so forth. Whether we're ill prepared or not, any aim at the whole of God's comprehensive truth is going to take a lifetime. And that's another thing that I think our sort of culture of certification and so on and so forth denies. It's not about lifelong learning. That's true, but that's not what I'm not talking about. Some kind of trope like that. I'm talking about the patience that scholarship involves, and that in this case theology involves, which demands it's a long haul business, and we're in the short haul business. It seems a 3-year degree, if that. I mean, think about seminaries. Seminaries have been whittling down how long it takes to get certified for over a century, more than that. I mean, seminaries haven't been around that long, so I guess I shouldn't push it back too far. But the notion that I'm going to get a degree in 2 years, and maybe I'll do a course here and I'll do a course there, and and then I'll get my degree and I'll go do what I'm supposed to do. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very functional, and necessarily so if you have a family to feed and a job you need and so on. But that's not theology. Mm-hmm. Theology is something that takes forever. And therefore we have to provide the institutions and the frameworks by which that kind of learning can happen, such that the synthetic commitments of faculty members. I mean, why, Rusty, do faculty members not want to share this set of commitments to this sort of larger synthetic truth? Well, why not? And there are lots of reasons, obviously, but
it's not publishable in a peer-reviewed journal.
Not publishable in a peer-reviewed thing. Okay, I mean, it's part of the product of academia. Academia is now defined by its products.
I was going to say both of the issues have been identified. It seemed to me to come back to this issue, which to me I think gets at the heart of perhaps the biggest challenge facing theological education right now, which is the takeover of education by thinking in terms of certification and education as a form of gaining status and certification rather than being actually oriented toward the pursuit of knowledge. So I mean, this is what I witnessed going, when I was at in pursuing a PhD in theology. I was taken aback by this sense, you talk about the aspiration being, you don't need to know everything because you're part of a community of shared knowledge in which you're each sharing in the blessings of what each other know. But that's not how so much the academy functions. So much of the academy functions in terms of sort of protecting your turf, defending your intellectual property, demonstrating, you don't want to share your ideas because you're afraid someone else is going to take credit for them, right? And so it's you. And
there was a time where plagiarism was not only common, it was commonly accepted. Now, I'm not saying
So the issue here is, of course, the pursuit of original. I think this is one of the biggest problems. Is the pursuit of originality that's the sine qua non of advancement in contemporary academy. And of course, the historic tradition of theology is often about eschewing originality. And so, of course, professors project that to students, what they're most concerned with is status. And so the students think that their education is about status. And so it's about getting a certification. And so the pressure is to get that certification as easily and quickly as possible. So I think these things are kind of connected. Now,
Robert Jensen told me that when he he was teaching at Oxford in the mid-60s, there was still a generation of dons that thought that a PhD would ruin a man. And that the only people who really were good dons were people with master's degrees who hadn't over-specialized.
That's
Wow.
interesting. You know, I definitely don't want to give the false impression that the school I'm working for has everything figured out, because nobody does, and we have our own challenges. But I've been thinking about what Rusty and Ephraim are describing, what you're describing too, Brad. And it seems to me that at least in some situations, being a teaching first Christian liberal arts undergraduate program offers us some freedom. So I was thinking about the three things that were just discussed. Synthesis, for example. I get to teach a course sequence called Western Civilization, and I co-teach that with a history professor. We teach it every sophomore takes it an entire year long, and we're both in the class. We're interacting, talking about, okay, how does literature, how does history interact? And of course, although I'm not trained in philosophy or theology or political science, you know, we're both bringing whatever knowledge we have on those subjects to bear. And so that's an opportunity where we can literally synthesize. And in fact, one of the, I hate to use the phrase learning outcomes, but one of our goals for the class, for the students, is that they have to synthesize that history and literature, that it's not just this, you know, literature paper over here and history over here. They have to write in-class exams that tie those things. And, you know, you mentioned earlier, Brad, that you know, the sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, liberal or woke or, you know, so many terms, but, you know, I have the freedom to teach Western Civ, and I'm not afraid of getting in trouble for it. I'm also not afraid of criticizing, you know, the bad things about Western tradition, right? I mean, and I tell my students, I'm not teaching this because I think that we're superior to anyone else. That's not my concern. My concern is this is where we are.
Right.
Shawnee, Oklahoma is in the West, and we need to know where we are and how we got here. So that's what we're doing. Also that, you know, that long-term, I've found, you know, Ephraim was talking about that importance of that it's a long haul. And I've found myself telling students something that's maybe sort of undermines my work, because I tell them in a comp class, for example, I can't teach you to write in 15 weeks. And I teach them in this Civ class, I can't teach you to love Dante in 2 weeks. I can't, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to trust me. And I want you to trust all of those who came before me who have attested to the fact that Dante is worth studying. And you're going to read him once in this class, but my hope is that you'll get a little taste of that love for beauty, and you'll come back over and over. And sometimes I feel like that's the best I can do. But if I can point them to the fact that this is long-term, that this class is not enough to prepare you to understand the world, but maybe it can give you a framework to interpret and to enter into that conversation. And lastly, you know, there was the talk about the pressure to perform. When I got out of grad school, I immediately tried to publish my dissertation, and I revised it badly and sent it off to a very good press who was interested, and I felt very flattered. And they said no, and rightfully so, honestly, because it needed a lot more revision, as dissertations often do. And I haven't had time to get back to it. But, you know, I've published a few things, scholarly things since then, but I have not had the institutional pressure to publish. And what that has done for me is, when I write, I'm going to write about things that I believe are worth writing about. I don't have to write in order to keep my job. I don't have to publish just to publish. And I feel, at least in my field of literature, there's a lot of scholarship out there that is just nonsense. Like, it just doesn't need to be published. It shouldn't have been published. And I think, why did anyone write this? Who wants to read this? And the answer is, well, somebody needed to feed their family. And that's a legitimate reason. So I don't know what this means, but it's fascinating to me that at an undergraduate level, there are some of these problems are alleviated. We have other problems, but some of these problems are alleviated.
Now, Alan, I'm curious, I mean, how unique do you think your experience there at OKBU is? Do you think there are a dozen other Christian liberal arts colleges that are where you would say the stars have aligned similarly, or not?
With some of those things, yes. So, for example, a lot of my colleagues at at teaching first Christian liberal arts universities also don't have a lot of pressure to publish. The emphasis is upon teaching. Frankly, teaching 4 classes, and grading papers, it's not realistic for me to do much publishing. So that part is true. The synthesis, what we do in that Western Civ course sequence is not common. It's not common, and I will say that that's something that we have to continually be communicating to the students and donors and families and administrators that this is a good idea because it looks really weird. So I don't know that it's all that common.
Okay.
Yeah, I could say that it's a blessing to be in an undergraduate only environment for the reasons that Alan identified, which is that you can take risks as a teacher. PhD students, good PhD students, you're always worried about that you're playing catch up to them because they're so focused and team teaching across your discipline and things like that. That's much more common in undergraduate only environments. So I was very fortunate to teach for 20 years, and I had many of the same experiences you had, Alan, teaching with colleagues in different fields and really learning a lot from my colleagues in those kinds of contexts. And I think that's also quite possible. I don't know what your experience is from a seminary context, which is, I think part of it is, a seminary that's got a clear sense of mission is not dominated by the professional associations that are the lifeblood of most kind of disciplinary focused academic institutions. And anytime you have that common focus as a group of instructors, you can often interact and work together to achieve that goal.
I think that's right. In smaller seminaries, I've been part of different ones. But even a place like where I teach, Wycliffe, which has a very balanced and I think fairly focused sense of mission that's shared. We're also part of a larger graduate school, theological graduate school, and a university in a big city. And we draw our students, from a wide catchment of backgrounds and so on. I'm moving up from the undergraduate level now to this other level. Everything seems to change at that point. In terms of what people, the residential college, which does cost a ton of money, we have to say, and it leaves a lot of people behind who can't afford it or don't have access to it, is a very special thing. As I said, it's one of the closest things to sort of a traditional seminary, residential, formative, immersive setting as one can get, I think, in this broad synthetic way we've been talking about. But modern seminaries generally are not like that anymore. They're made up of people who now, the average age of seminarians has gone up quite a bit. Many are married, they have kids. You have people, men and women from different backgrounds with different economic burdens. It isn't, I'm just sorry to say, there are a few left, but not many, which can follow that undergraduate type of model, reshaped for the type of education being offered. Seminaries, even if the faculty are pretty well, and the faculty are torn apart based by all these things. There are a lot of demands that come from different directions, which isn't to say good things don't happen, but I think things begin to unravel at this stage in terms of some of the virtues that we've been talking about. The vices of academia, which are inbuilt in our current era, are shared across the board once you leave. And it isn't just, it's not that all undergraduate programs are protected from them, but once you leave at least that possibility behind, I think graduate education is in a whole nother realm, just is. And that's to me the challenge, because that's where our ministers are coming from. That's where our, future teachers are coming from, and so on.
Yeah, Ephraim.
Let me just jump in real quick. Something I meant to say at the beginning for all of our participants is we're going to take a break at about 8:45 or so. just a few-minute break. And at that point, please be thinking of any questions that you want to ask. And you can use the chat box at that point, and I'll moderate those and put those to our speakers. So was one of you about to say something? Because if not, I was about to pursue.
Well, I mean, the American academic imagination is a fusion of the Oxford Cambridge Residential College, which is a direct descendant of the studium, the religious orders that where community and learning were fused together, and the German Research University. And that tension, well, I think, was fruitful for 100 years in the American context, from the late 19th century through to maybe the end of the 20th century. But for reasons, I think Ephraim's quite right, I think primarily for reasons of cost and maybe changing demographics, it's been very hard for seminaries to sustain that, harder than it has been for liberal arts colleges. I mean, parents often want their kids to have that unique experience. But when I was coming out of college, the seminary divinity school model was still a residential communal learning model. And I think from what I can see, that has been very much transformed by distance learning and the economic pressures of people going for seminary degrees who are mid-career. You know, they're changing their careers, they've got families, and there's just no way they're gonna go to Nashotah House in rural Wisconsin and spend 3 years in this kind of intimate learning environment.
Now, one thing I want to turn to here that we haven't quite touched on is, and I think the reason we haven't touched on it is because we've been talking about the institutional context that exists, and what those institutional contexts have not served very well is the needs of the non-full-time student, of the pastor who wants continuing theological education. Perhaps he never had proper seminary formation to begin with, or even if he did, as we've said, the pursuit of theology is a lifelong task. The lay person who wants theological formation is not going to go and do a degree program, whose pastor is probably not equipped enough to be the pastor and the professor for the local church. So as I read this forum was kind of prompted in part by Ephraim's essay, Theology After the Virus, looking at how coronavirus is putting a huge amount of strain on many existing institutions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it will create space for new kinds of theological education to fill the gap that's being created. And as I read that, one of your one thing that you were particularly excited about there was the possibility that these new fora could be an opportunity to draw in different kinds of students that are excluded largely, as we said, by cost and institutional structure from our existing institutions.
Well, I think the place where that could happen, I mean, I have no idea what's really possible and what will happen. It's a little bit of futurology here, but I do think a place it could happen in a fruitful way is precisely by folding theological education back into the congregational life of the church. And I don't mean that in a sort of haphazard or contingent way, but within congregations that are stable, that are richly textured in their membership and their resources, I think that is going to be potentially a place where both different kinds of theological education can happen and probably should happen. That goes back to my sense of the pantological vocation is one, and as Alan has noted, it's one that is shared. That's how it's fulfilled, is when it's shared within the body of Christ. And I think congregations remain the main place where the energies of Christian service and the resources that uphold it is to be found still. I think one of the sad things is that seminaries and so on have become, over time, increasingly divorced from congregations, as well as congregational support. Not only do congregations not necessarily support seminarians the way they might once have. They don't necessarily support seminaries. I mean, they're different places, you know, one's an institution out there and we're the real thing. But I do think there's a whole set of historical models for this, whether they're cathedral schools or other sorts of charity schools in England and so on and so forth, where learning takes place within a congregation in formal ways and obviously in informal ways. Congregations there are many congregations in the United States that have the resources to support full-time or mostly full-time theological scholars and teachers. They can. They choose not to. Or, I mean, they choose not to. They haven't been challenged to do so, perhaps. And that also means there's the opportunities to do the other kinds of things. But I don't think you have to send lay people who are interested off to sit in a class somewhere with a bunch of part-time seminarians who have their own vision about what they're doing. That can be awfully difficult. I think it happens in the place where the Spirit of Christ is alive. That's in the body of Christ. So anyway, I think that's worth thinking about and pursuing.
Alan, did you have something you wanted to interject there? Or? No? Okay.
That sounds good. I was affirming that, especially that point that Ephraim's making, that important point that there are congregations that can afford to do this. That's one of the things that gives me hope and frustrates me, is that looking at the kind of resources that evangelicals have in the United States, the kinds of things, the problems that we're identifying, I think a lot of them can be overcome. It's not that there aren't the funds. Not every school can be transformed in the way we'd like, but I do think that a lot of these positive changes could be accomplished. It's sort of a matter of priority, of will, of education. Yeah, I don't have any answers to that.
I would say also that when our intellectual culture is leavened by Christianity to a significant degree, intellectually curious church-going Christians have a variety of resources with which to grow and develop intellectually and in their faith. But as our intellectual culture becomes more de-Christianized, I think it becomes more, I think the churches will naturally gravitate towards having ministries that are intellectually oriented and not just pastorally oriented. And that may be a false distinction in and of itself, precisely because there's a growing need for it, because it's not being satisfied by the general atmosphere. You can't go to your local college to take a night course that might satisfy that desire in a way that was, perhaps, quite a reasonable expectation 2 generations ago.
Now, one thing that we haven't talked about here, but is something we talk about here at Davenant a lot, is one of the problems in the realm of theological education right now is a supply and demand problem, where there is an oversupply. At least for many years, there's been an oversupply of PhD-trained theologians relative to the number of full-time positions. Even increasingly, the number of there's been moved toward adjunctification of higher education. With coronavirus, many institutions downsizing. Many of these PhD-trained theologians aren't even going to be able to find adjunct gigs. So we have this army of qualified but unemployable potential theological educators. I think that it's sort of clamoring for new institutional contexts, ideally kind of small entrepreneurial ones and church-focused ones in which to exercise their gifts. So I think there's a golden opportunity here if churches are willing to embrace it, to say, there are so many churches around in America. I know of, there's so many churches where there's a trained potential theological educator there in the congregation, not able to use his gifts in an institutional setting. That there's a golden opportunity for that church to create one of these kinds of communities. So I think
one thing, I know we're not answering panelists, but I've seen some questions. One came up and said, like, congregations aren't really that interested in theological education. I mean, one wouldn't want to speak for all congregations, but I imagine that that's generally true. That's not on the top of the funding budget list. And so congregations have to change. I mean, it's a circular thing. There has to be a new thirst and a new sense of what's possible and so on. I mean, you know, our congregations were Zoom congregations before our seminaries were. I don't just mean online. I mean the notion of in and out and in and out. And I have time for this and I come for that. And theological education, I will keep beating this drum. It's long term, it's long haul, it's about stability and so on. And so congregations have to be committed to that as well, to that kind of vision within the context of who they are. I don't have an answer to how that happens, but there has to be some sort of synergistic growth in that vision.
Well, you know, First Things, we have rafters groups, readers of First Things groups, and we do these day-and-a-half long intellectual retreats. So there can be parachurch ministries that focus on engaging people with the riches of the Christian theological tradition. And, you know, how much of an appetite is there for that? I mean, I agree with Ephraim. I mean, part of it is you have to build an audience, you have to build a clientele, you have to build a community of people hungry for more.
Yeah, I think it's an important point about parachurch organizations. I mean, to borrow a distinction from Herman Bavinck, I think it is, you know, that I want to distinguish between the institutional church and the organic church. And it seems to me that what we're talking about here in terms of the need for multiplying contexts of theological education is in many ways a vocation of the organic church. We don't have to be thinking in terms of a local congregation as an institute or a diocese or whatever, having a budget line item for a theological education program. Or do you think that, Ephraim? Do you think this is an institutional church responsibility?
I think it is. I don't think it's only that. I mean, this isn't to exclude the sort of more parachurch thing. I do worry that we're tempted in our culture to, when things are, you know, challenges like now, to think in terms of, you know, venture startups. Everything's a venture startup. I'm going to be an entrepreneur and I'm going to start something new and we'll do that. And I think good things can come out of that, but there's got to be I'm repeating myself, of stability, of communal stability that can receive and offer the kind of wisdom that theology is all about.
I mean, my experience with the Reformed tradition is that it's probably the best in the United States in this regard. I remember living in Lincoln, Nebraska, and going to a parish, or a congregationally organized and sponsored conference. That's where I met Jim Jordan and Peter Lighthart for the first time, and very well attended, conducted at a, it was not academic in the pejorative sense, but it was at a very high level. And you had lay involvement in terms of people attending lectures and questions. I kind of walked away thinking, wow, this is what Ephraim, I think, is commending as a model of a community of people that want to learn together and grow in their faith, and that they want to grow not just in prayer and not just in doing witnessing to Christ to the larger community, but also to grow intellectually in their faith. So I think it happens, and there are models out there, I think, of where this is done well. Can't say I've witnessed the same thing in the Catholic parishes, but typically the Catholic model is people who have these kinds of interests gravitate towards, affiliate themselves with religious orders whose apostolate is, whether it's Jesuits or Opus Dei or Dominicans or Benedictine monastery that might have might actually house a seminary in it. So in the Catholic tradition, people don't typically look to the parish as the place to answer that need. They look to the surrounding movements and orders that have that as their apostolate. So I think there's all of our traditions, most of our traditions have elements that can be nurtured and built upon in order to make this aspect stronger.
Now, here's a question that might be controversial, right? Let's talk about distance learning. Let's talk about things like Zoom. Although I think we kind of all agreed here on sort of the ideal of what we would like to see more of in terms of local communities engaged in a lifelong pursuit of theology. We also recognize that this is not, as we said, it's not a budget priority of many churches right now. It's going to take a lot of time, I think, for that shift to happen. And yet, in the meantime, there is, I think, a huge unmet demand out there for people in the churches, pastors hungry for ongoing education, looking for opportunities to learn. And obviously, distance learning is one of the ways that is the number one way that can happen in a very cost-effective way. And this is the big question that the last few months is posing. I think many of us had kind of an instinctive allergy to distance learning. We can talk about all the drawbacks, all the things that you don't get. And yet, something like this, I mean, if you'd asked me a few years ago, even maybe before this year, if we could have a great conversation like we're having here now that feels fairly natural and it's flowing and we're sharing insights and we're all hundreds of miles away and lots of people are sitting watching us, I wouldn't have believed that was a viable thing. So do we need to be realists and unlearn a little bit and overcome a bit of our snobbery towards the prospects for distance learning? Let me throw this one to Alan first. Since being more of my generation, he might be more likely to
agree with you.
more bullish.
Well, yeah. I mean, I share the allergy. So last semester, like the entire world, it seemed, we were thrust into online education, and it was the hardest semester I've for teaching for me. And part of this. Ephraim mentioned this, I think, before we started, was, being able to read my students and figure out, okay, what are they thinking? What do they comprehend? What do they have questions about? I realized suddenly that I work, when I'm in front of students, a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to read them to see what I need to do to help them understand things. And what I found was that last semester, all my students had what I called the resting Zoom face, which is something like this. And and so I had no idea, if they were even looking at the camera, I had no idea what was going on. Are you listening to me? Do you have questions? It was impossible. So I think there are some serious flaws, and I think the idea of particularly, and I want to be specific, particularly undergraduate education, I think trying to use that model is problematic. That transition from high school to college, the 18-year-old, in my experience, some of the most formative moments have been just coming into my office and having an opportunity for me to talk about how the gospel relates to their studies or their future career or their life. And that's hard to happen. It's difficult to have those kind of interactions online. However, Brad, you mentioned the pastor that wants to continue education, and you mentioned that this forum right here, that it's been successful. I've had similar experiences too. I had an opportunity to teach or to lead a cohort through some cultural questions, and they were all pastors or former students. And the level of discourse we could have and the ease of our conversation was much better. So I do think that there are some kinds of conversations, some kinds of learning that I think are possible in this format in a reasonable way without too much loss. It's never the same as being in the room, but I think some meaningful work can be done if you're very thoughtful about the kind of thing that you're teaching, the kind of conversations you're having, the kind of audience that you're looking for.
I mean, my sense is just to be realistic, which is that, I mean, books, I mean, you can obviously learn from books. You can go to a library, get books out, read them, and learn. You can learn from watching webcasts. You can learn by being one of 500 people in a lecture hall. So there's different modes of learning, and what we're experiencing right now is a kind of warm version of reading a book. So the folks that are listening in, they glean and they gain information. They get new thoughts. They can work through some ideas, and it's warmed by a kind of visual, interactive environment made possible by the technology. And I think it's all for the best, but it is what it is. But I think what Alan's saying is that I don't think you can use this technology to form people and mentor them in the way that, you know, the small, more intimate setting of a classroom allows you to do it, and obviously the one-on-one of mentoring allows you to do. So, you know, just realism about what this technology can do and realism about what it can't do. I think there's no reason not to embrace it and use it to its best potential.
Ephraim, anything to add?
Well, I'm probably the least positive about it, but I agree with everything that's been said. Be realistic. Oh, we have to do it. So there's no point complaining about it right now. We have to do it. The question is, do we want to use this? Does it have a special purpose that can only be met by this? And maybe this whole distance question. I mean, I just remembered, I hadn't thought about this for ages. When I was first ordained, I went to work in Burundi, East Africa. And my first job was to do something that at the time was considered very avant-garde. It was called Theological Education by Extension, TEE. People don't go to seminaries, you go to them. So I got this motorcycle and I rode around all over the place, seeing 2 people here, 1 person there, and so on and so forth. And I kept doing this and falling off in the mud, and I was miserable and spending the night and this, that, and the other. Well, you know, I think everybody agreed, and I'll get to my point. I think everybody agreed that this was not the best way for these people to be trained theologically. What it did do, it did 2 things. First of all, it built relationships that were extraordinarily important. You know, to be not exactly nursed after you bang up your motorcycle by your student is something different. And so it built these relationships through difficult, demanding physical extension. That was the extension part, not theological education. Secondly, it was a great propedeutic. Those relationships then turned into people wanting to learn together with the people they got to know. I think that if what we're doing in any way can be understood as somehow feeding into building what will in fact be fleshly relationships, that's to the good. If it's seen as an end in itself, I'm sorry, I just don't think that fulfills the calling of theological education. You know, unless I'll leave it at that. I think you get my point.
Well, I would add on this one that to use my book metaphor, I remember when I was in my 20s, you'd meet people, you'd see people carrying a copy of Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and you would know this is a person. Wow, I want to talk to this person. And as Ephraim said, it was that. So the book midwifed the possibility of this kind of person-to-person engagement. And I'm with him. I mean, if this technology is an end in itself, we're all impoverished. If it's a means to opportunities for communion, I think more power to it.
Yeah, I think that's an important way of seeing it. I think it's a way, if used well, of widening the funnel and bringing more people into theological education who have been left out of it.
And we found that at Wycliffe. I mean, we've been doing online courses for years, and many of the people in them eventually end up coming to the seminary. That's good. I mean, it's not that what they got before wasn't good, but its value came to fruition when they actually also moved to a place where they were with others. I think that's important.
Now, let me frame a question here. So one of the challenges that most anyone would agree on when looking at all sorts of different sorts of institutions in the education landscape is the issue of spiraling costs. And, there's all kinds of factors that play into this, but, as we said, this is one of the challenges that seminaries have, is that it is a physical place, but it's not actually a community in any meaningful sense, because, it's families that might have to live a long way away for affordable housing, and, they come in for classes and they head back out to the suburbs or whatever. So if that's the case, then it seems like, one of the priorities should be thinking of what are ways of financially streamlining our educational institutions. And obviously, distance learning is one way of doing that. So here's the question is, can you compensate for the obvious weaknesses of distance learning by combining that sort of broad funnel distance learning with kind of short residential intensives? And by doing that, you can have institutions that can have the time students have together is actually much deeper and more meaningful than it sort of was before. And you can have much smaller physical footprint for an institution, and therefore more cost effective. What do you think of that as a model for the future of theological education?
To get what Ephraim emphasizes, which is that this is a kind of one foot in front of the other, day after day after day after day. And I'm all for these it's like making a retreat or something, these intensive, you're there for a week or two, but life isn't like that. Life has a much more plodding character to it. And so residential learning, it prepares you for that, because the semester is long. As I recall, when I was a professor, the semester can be very long indeed.
It is very long. It's longer in a pandemic, I found. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, Alan, please.
In economics, there's this, the theory of second best. I think it's in economics. Well, in any case, I think there are some situations where, particularly people married or with families, or alternative learning situations, where what you just described would, Brad, I think would be great. I mean, it would be better than strictly online education. Having a couple of weeks of intensive learning, I think, would be significantly better. So that the students actually build relationships with other students as they're doing these kinds of classes, and then meeting each other in person, and then having meals together for a couple of weeks. I think that could be great. I don't think it should be what we're aspiring to, but I think I think that's a legitimate and as an option. I think that could be good.
Yeah, let me interject that typically this is preferred because it lets people work in order to pay for it. It's not actually cheaper for the institution. They charge the same amount of money for that as they charge for credit hours of residential classes. So I would wonder whether it's really actually a cost saving. It's just a reorganization of the learning process to let people have full-time jobs to pay for it all.
Which isn't a bad idea.
I mean,
could be necessary. I mean, given the reality of our time.
I mean, I think that's the case currently. Institutions are charging the same amount for these sorts of things because it's an alternate to the main thing they do. But structurally, it ought to be able to be done much cheaper, because an institution needs a smaller physical footprint in that case.
Let me give two
Yes.
I'm experienced two different ways I've seen this happen. One way is many, I think, standard DMin, Doctor of Ministry programs, will have people come in to work together intensively for a month or 2 weeks or whatever, and they do their cohort courses together, and then they go off and back to their ministries and so on. Those I know are fascinating, usually, to the people who are there. They meet They meet ministry, people doing ministry in many different contexts, sometimes from around the world, if it's a bigger school, and so on. So it's very stimulating in a way, but it only goes so far. The other place I've seen this happen, well, one place was in Egypt, in North Africa, in the Anglican Church there, and they do a lot of their teaching this way. What's fascinating to me is, I mean, these people from Algeria and Tunisia and Egypt and so on, so they're not all the same country and so on, but they come together for these intensive things. They may know each other from a previous time and so on, but they share some deep common challenges to their faith as Christians in predominantly Muslim societies, but also deep faith that allows them to do that. There's something about, they've got a common Christian vocation that they're sharing that allows that coming together for these intensive residential things, even though they don't live with each other otherwise much, to really have some kind of fire. So, you know, one way to, I don't know, but if it's possible to think about these things is you get people who are actually sharing something together to come in, not just, you know, I'll sign up for this course. That's really interesting. I'll meet some interesting people, but actually I'm coming together for this time with people because we're part of a common mission right now. I mean, however that's defined. I think there could be a difference in the way the power of those brief residential times together can work. But again, I see no reason why one can't do that, and it's better than not doing it at all, certainly, for all kinds of reasons.
When you were saying that, it reminded me of something I would add on one of the benefits that can be found, I think, in this distance learning that I've seen teaching classes for our Davenant Hall program, is that you get people precisely because you get people who are, this is part-time, they've got many other things going on. You get a fascinating mix of people that you wouldn't get in, you know, undergraduate institution or seminary. Everyone's kind of the same stage of life. I mean, less so at the seminary than undergrad, but you know, this is what they're doing right now. They're going to college, they're going to seminary. With an online course that's open to people all over the world, you get somebody who's a research scientist who's also interested in theology, so they can be a better witness to their fellow scientists. You get a housewife with 3 kids who's a stay-at-home mom but wants to learn more about theology. You get a pastor, you get a graduate student, and each of them bring remarkably different perspectives to the material in a way that I think can, particularly, to your point, I think, I mean, it's a poor substitute in a way for what ideally would happen in a sort of robust local church-based theological education. But the benefit is that you have, you get to see the body of Christ in its diversity and look at the same theological questions from many different angles. So I think we're at 8:48 right now. With that, I think we're going to take about 5 minutes just for anybody who, if anyone needs to stretch their legs, and if anyone has been pondering a question that they're wanting to formulate, please formulate your question and post it in the chat box. And I'm not necessarily going to ask them just in the order that they're presented there. I'll kind of sort out, which sort of common themes, that sort of thing.
Okay. I'll be right back then.
How much longer are we going to go after?
Oh, sorry, till 9:30.
Fantastic.
Or 8:30 your time.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat box or anything new. Oh, there. Someone just posted just right now. There we go. Okay. All right, cool. Questions are popping in. I know my buddy Anzi has a good question too, so he can ask that.
Oh, Lindsay's on there, is he?
Supposedly he's lurking there somewhere, yeah. All right, how do I pop out the chat box? There we go. You guys can see the questions too, right? Okay.
I see some of them. I don't know if
I mean, I'll organize it, but you know, it's yeah. If you see the exact text, then that's helpful too. Let's see here. Okay. All right. All right. I think we have enough to get started. Feel free to add questions if they come to you. We have a couple questions here, noting the fact that we've focused on the forms of theological education, institutional contexts, modes of delivery, the role of community, etc. But we haven't touched at all, interestingly, on the content of theological education, which could really, I mean, that really ought to be perhaps a separate webinar of its own. But I think, so a couple people are asking, as theological educators, and I think let me put this first primarily to Ephraim, since he is sort of most fully engaged on a regular basis teaching theology as such, although as we've said, it's really want to define it very broadly. But, you know, someone phrased it well. They said, where'd it go? They said, lost it out here. Oh yeah, there you go. You had 4 years to tell them everything they need to know about long haul Christianity. Where would you begin? So given that the pursuit of theology needs to be a lifelong task, where should start? What should our priorities be in theological education? And perhaps that you could sharpen your answer to this by saying perhaps where have our priorities been misplaced? Where does contemporary theological education often perhaps focus too much on the wrong things or at the wrong time?
Yeah, and I don't think there's from my point of view, a right answer to that. There are different ways of approaching it. I think when we had a conversation earlier, Brad, I shared that, and I mentioned my first job was working in Burundi, and it was after I fell off the motorcycle too many times, I decided to actually build a school. It was sort of a Bible college thing, and it was residential. The thing is, there were no books, and all anybody had were Bibles. And the assumption was that it was going to be a curriculum that was, you know, relatively standard. You have obviously scripture, but you have theology and ethics and history and pastoral care and so on. But the only book you had was the Bible. And the question was, could you do in this case a 3-year program when that's all you had? Now, as a teacher, the expectation is I had more than that. I had a little more than that, and I had received more than that. It was a fascinating experience to me that I didn't do well, obviously, and I was young, but I still think that it opened up a way of thinking that I think was really helpful for me and maybe for the students, I don't know, which was, again, to bring the whole world to bear through the Word of God. And it didn't mean all we did was read the Bible, but it did mean that everything, we had to take everything in, politics and everything, through this lens and with the tools that Scripture offered. I think Scripture is the primary place, and everything else, there should be everything else, as much as you can fit in. We have a required for the MDiv set of courses that leaves very few electives. I'm not saying they're the best way to do it, but there's no room to do everything. So you have to not do some things, but you have to figure out a way to bring the world into the Word of God somehow. The world can come, and there are different ways to do that. Classic theological works and so on. And I do think, though, if that's your goal, you're going to actually, there will be variety, but it won't be anything. See, because one of the things that happens now is everybody has ideas. We have to learn this, we have to learn this, we have to learn that. You try to shoehorn it into a curriculum, it gets bloated. Some of that disappears when you understand that it's all going into the single river, and the river carries you through. That's my sense. So Scripture and the classical theological writings that our different traditions have, but you can't cover them all, and some historical knowledge. We have more knowledge available to us than anybody ever, anywhere, at any time. And yet we don't know what to do with it all. And I think one of the issues is to provide the framework, again, scripturally, that allows all of these things to find their place as different people and their different traditions are able to bring it to bear.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Let me pose a related question, which is, I talked earlier about the problem of students perhaps being underprepared for college and for seminary and so on. And as Rusty said, in every generation, teachers complain about that. But I do think this is a growing challenge in many ways, and part of that is not the fact that maybe the average person is less educated. Part of it is the fact that we have so much pressure, particularly at the college level. There's so much pressure to put everyone into college. And so it used to would have been college students would have self-selected a bit more. And now we have this ideal of universal education. But I think it's also the case that biblical literacy is perhaps not what it is, certainly not what it once was in the wider society. I mean, it used to be you could count, you didn't have to work so hard to instill biblical literacy because it was just around. You just picked it up from culture. And I think evangelical churches have maybe did a better job of instilling biblical literacy 50 years ago, perhaps, than they do now. So I'd like to ask this question for you, Alan, as someone teaching undergraduates. What would you say in terms, we talked about where would you start in terms of the theological education? I want to frame in terms of what is missing most in the students you encounter that you feel like is a sort of necessary foundation for the task of education that you want to pursue? Right.
So, I think what I've ended up doing is adjusted my my understanding of what my mission is. I would like to see students who are regularly reading novels and poetry in high school. I have often spoken to students who said, you know what, I got through high school without having to read a single book. That's not uncommon at all. Or I wrote one paper or something like this, right? And so I'm conflicted about that, right? So on one hand, I sometimes I think, well, is this going to be the right place for you, or are you going to be floundering because you haven't been prepared? But then I think that student is my neighbor, and they're going to be voting, and they're going to be in my congregation, in my neighborhood. And frankly, if I can teach them how to write a thesis and how to think, just start them in that process of how to think, if I can encourage them to cultivate habits of reading, Yes, it's true. I'm not going to be able to take that student in 4 years as far as I could take a student who is well read out of high school, and I can start much further on. But in my community, this is important. If we lived in a society where I could say I trust the public schools to provide the basic civics and the basic sort of broad understanding of society, of the world, that is necessary to be a good citizen, then I would feel a lot better saying, well, college should be more specific. But right now, I try to. I see that there's some real value in meeting students where they are when they are committed to education. Now, some students are not prepared, and the reason that they're not prepared is they're not interested in the process of higher education. And at that point, there's not a whole lot you can do. But the ones who just didn't have a great teacher, and it's not their fault at all. Their parents put them in this school. The school only had, these kinds of teachers who were probably overworked and underpaid, and this is what we get. So for them, I take great joy in being able to teach them, okay, how do you write an essay? How do you think logically? How do you enter into public discourse? How do you read a book? And so I've been trying to not dwell on Rusty said earlier that, this has always been a problem, and that's absolutely right. And I think you can let it eat you up, right? And you can just be overwhelmed. But as I said, at the end of the day, these are my neighbors, and I want them to be competent, citizens and members of my church and neighboring churches.
Thanks. Very helpful. There's another question here that I think gets to our earlier conversation about perhaps how the preoccupation with certification has harmed the project of education. So someone asks, do you think there is a presupposed obsession with the notion of accreditation, or a fear to branch out and do theological education for the sake of a type of theologia or hybrid of Wissenschaft and paideia in the life of the church? In other words, does accreditation stand in the way of the future of good theological education? This is something that, Alan, in your essay on the value of Christian college, you talked about the importance of accountability and the value of an institutional context of education as providing accountability for good teaching and certain academic standards. And ideally, this is what accreditation does. But I think many would say that it can also become a way of just checking boxes of bloating institutional bureaucracies. And indeed, a lot of the increase in the cost of education has been an increase in the cost of the kind of bureaucratic compliance side of things, and rather than the actual teaching side. So, do we need to get over the idea of accreditation for the sake of the future of theological education?
I have some thoughts, but I bet Reno there has some pointed comments to make first.
Oh, I'm out of academia now, and one of the blessings of being out of academia is not have to worry about accreditation.
Well, I'll tell you, we're in the middle of accreditation, two different accreditation issues, one from the state and one from the. I think it's not that the idea is wrong. I mean, you talk about accountability. Accountability is pretty important. You got to have it somehow. So the fact that I think the current forms by which accreditation is pursued and laid on people are bad doesn't mean I don't think accountability, but they're not doing their job. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not going to name any names. It's you talked about bloated, but it's more than that. It's raising up standards that are, many of them, not all of them, are not only distracting, they're contrary to the mission of theological education itself. And but I'm somebody who doesn't really think grades are the most important thing to press and for students and others. But I do think accountability is important. But we have different standards that we're after. We've talked about this. What is theology? What does it mean to do this? And if you're doing online, if you're doing a short residential, these are all different things, and they have to be held accountable, not to different sort of larger standards, but different methods by which one understands whether jobs are being done well or not. I don't have an answer to that, but I do think that the whole accreditation thing is, it's an emperor not without clothes. It is that in one way.
Overburdened with clothes.
But the other one is that it's right. It's being thrown into a lake and you can't swim. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that. But in terms of sort of, is it constraining our ability to do theological education in new ways that's serious? Yes. But here's the thing. We shouldn't confuse trying new things with getting rid of accountable rigor of some kind. And I think that sometimes that happens, everything goes on the fly. We say, oh, we're not part of that system, so we don't have to worry about that. Somebody just said, is it increasingly politicized? I see that, and the answer is yes, but I'm not going to go into that.
All right. Let's see here. Let me ask Anzi's question here. So one thing I'd love to see discussed is the state of academic theology as a discipline. Is it dead? If so, why? If not, what's keeping it alive? And crucially, the institutions that teach students are also the institutions that support academic scholarship in theology. If those institutions go, what happens to trained theologians? Do they get support in writing real theology, et cetera? So yeah, I think this is a good question, because our focus here has been on a sort of democratizing vision of theological education. If theology is supposed to be a lifelong pursuit for every Christian in the churches, sort of what we're kind of aiming at, that's great. But there's an appropriate elitism within the discipline of theology, and within really any good academic discipline, a recognition that there are people who are called to a very rigorous, a kind of rigorous study that most of us are not, and that requires certain kinds of institutional support. And I think that would be one of the things to be most worried about in the current environment. Is there are bloated institutions of higher education that are under a lot of stress that some of us would be happy to see go for certain reasons. But what might be lost here? So yeah, sorry, I added my own editorializing too much. But you guys see the text of Anzi's question. Anyone want to tackle that?
My experience, theology it's more like law than it is like philosophy. In this sense, it is an intellectual discipline ordered towards the needs of a living community. And in the same way that, law is an academic discipline ordered towards the needs of a living body of jurisprudence. And so we have the crisis of theology, or the tension that many young people feel as they enter into graduate study in theology, is that it's not always clear, or the theology properly understood should be church-facing, not university-facing. And that when it turns into a university-facing discipline, then it loses touch with its primary vocation, which is to facilitate our ever deeper intellectual entry into the life and practice of the church. And this is a tension that's characterized theology throughout the modern era. And, the great figures like Karl Barth, who I, read, was deeply inspired by as a young man, were intellectuals of towering ability who decided to be church-facing and not university-facing.
But of course, he was formed. It required a university context of some people who were university-facing in order to form him to be church-facing.
I don't think that's the case, but it is the case that in the post-Reformation era, or really going back to the University of Paris in the 13th century, the placement of theology within the Western university has given theology access to tremendous resources of intellectual refinement and intellectual accountability. And as that setting for theology becomes less and less congenial, less and less hospitable, and true theology, which is church-facing, has to migrate out of the university or at least go further to the fringe, the effect is going to be to make theology more what I call primitive and less intellectually sophisticated. And I think this is the painful choice that we face in the 21st century. That the teachers that I learned from at Yale in the 1980s, that when they were young, they didn't have to face that choice. They were able to be formed in the most intellectually sophisticated environment in a church-oriented approach to theology. And many young people today, and I'm sympathetic with them, face a hard choice. I mean, they can go do a PhD in theology at an institution that really is, it's, as you pointed out, Brad, it's really religious studies and not theology. Or if it is theology, they can only do it by doing historical theology, because you can do academically rigorous study of medieval theology as an historical enterprise, but not as a real enterprise of these people are living voices of the Christian tradition being studied for what they tell us about, what we ought to think and believe. Instead, we study, you do your PhD and you study, how they were influenced by, how Bonaventure was influenced by so-and-so and so-and-so. And then you kind of get your theological education sort of on the sly, so to speak.
I don't disagree, Rusty. I mean, the choice, as you said, that we're now being forced to make, I think that is the case. I would want to say that it's not just unfortunate. I think that if possible, the church has a reason, the church, and therefore theologians of the church, have a reason to be concerned about the university. It isn't just that the university is inhospitable to theology. The university is inhospitable to learning. Not in every way, but in lots of ways. People have talked about this, the things that are being published and so on and so forth by really smart people are nobody's reading it, nobody's interested in it. They go to not me. You go to conferences and you give a paper to a few people and nobody remembers it, and on and on and on. Who cares? It shouldn't be that way. The universities of our society ought to be places of enormous intellectual energy, whether they're Christian or not. So Christians, I think, whether they're theologians or not, and every Christian ought to be part of, as I said, this theological current of some kind, some way, should be committed somehow to transfiguring, whether it's at a university or wherever they end up being, whatever that notion of knowledge at its best once was. In other words, even though we may be forced to turn to a kind of more primitive theological range because we're not part of the university, we can't be content with that. I don't think so. And I think that, a vision of somebody like Augustine, who was sort of at the end of, I guess, of a shrinkage, at the end of a great era in his time of academic life. He somehow was able, he was a second-rate intellectual when it came to institutions and so on. And yet he was able to turn all that into something new with the breadth of thirst. Well, this is my thing about sort of bringing in the fullness of God's creation into a theological vision. We can't let that go. We can't let that go.
But it might be the case. It might be the case that the churches actually sustain humanistic learning in the West as the university turns its back on, as you said, on that vision of the intellectual life.
Could be, but we have to press the church and hold them accountable
to the margins of the university, and we don't have within our power to reform it. We can witness in it, but we don't have the power to reform it. And if the universities want to commit this kind of spiritual intellectual suicide, we're going to have to figure out how to sustain the best fruits of the Western tradition, which came from this fusion of Athens and Jerusalem.
So I just noticed that there's a whole section for Q&A where people were, as they should, were posting questions, and I was only seeing the chat box. So we have quite a few questions, actually.
15 minutes.
Move through them fairly efficiently. Let me combine two questions here. So one is, it seems that everyone agrees that residential theological education is the ideal. What is your sense of the market for residential education, particularly at the seminary level? Is it becoming a luxury good that only some can afford, or will it be even more desired now that so many have been forced into an online model this year? And then someone else asked, I think this is a related question, can you comment further on where you see potential for theological education in the global South? Besides theological education by extension, what other options do you have under poverty or oppression? So I think part of the point there is one of the places where distance learning has been of most benefit and blessing is indeed to churches in the global South, which otherwise would not have access to it. So both of those questions sort of, given economic realities, should we embrace more of a future for distance?
I would say that in the Catholic Church, there's been consolidation of seminaries because of reduced demand, fewer seminarians, but there's been no retreat from in-person residential education, no retreat whatsoever. So there really is no online option for priestly formation in the Catholic Church of any sort whatsoever that I know of.
Right.
And in many non-Western countries,
I'll come back to it anyway. Sorry.
In many non-Western countries, just the economics makes residential seminaries actually easier to run. Don't cost as much. It's much easier to, you don't have all the infrastructure and so on. That's not always the case, but it's also desired. I mean, people want to be together in times of challenge and so on and so forth. So I actually don't think it's disappearing. As things become more economically complicated, residential seminaries are going to be harder to sustain outside of the West as well. But I think right now, many are flourishing at many different levels. Some very big and relatively sophisticated in terms of their resources. Others more simple. But there are a lot of residential seminaries in the South. And there's also a lot of desire to have people teach, whether they're local or from the West or whatever. I mean, there isn't quite the same worry about who all these people are. Come and share your knowledge. I mean, it's one of the heartening things about the larger church is it's not all about suspicion. It's about welcome as well.
So, Rusty mentioned, you talk about priestly formation, which I think highlights a question somebody asked. I'm not going to find the exact question, but gets something I kind of mentioned at the beginning, which is, what is the goal of theological education? Let me see if I can find the question.
Joey Royal.
What's that?
A Joey Royal. That's
Joey
yes.
Royal.
Let's
see here. Basically asking, is it priestly formation? Is priestly formation something, I'll put it this way, at least, since I'm having trouble finding it. Is priestly formation, there it is. Yeah, right, I found it. What are the goals of theological education? Mastering a body of knowledge, spiritual growth / acquiring virtue, developing professional skills related to vocation, all of these things. And I think a related question there is priestly formation, or Protestants would say pastoral training or whatever, is that a distinctive enough thing? Is what we're trying to do in terms of theological education for clergy a distinct enough thing that it ought to be its own institutional setting, or does it overlap enough with the goals of lay theological education that we should want to see those things happening more side by side?
The goal of theological education is to know the subject matter. The subject matter is God. God cannot be known except through complete devotion of heart, mind, and soul. And so priestly pastoral formation, is paradigmatic because it's the formation of the individual to devote his life to the service of God and his people. And so it's paradigmatic of, I think, of the goal of theological education. Even though in the Catholic tradition, it's actually a tremendous amount of practical stuff involved in that formation and a lot of spiritual rather than intellectual. And so typically we use theology to describe this more distinctively intellectual conformity of the soul to God, and devotion of the soul to God in its intellectual aspect. Whereas people think of pastoral and priestly work more in terms of devotion as manifest in actions and in service and distinctive offices like preaching and celebration of the Mass. But I don't think they're distinct. I mean, they're distinct, they're different, but they're not distinct. Or maybe they're distinct but not different, something like that. And there are reasons, I think, in the Catholic traditions, there was reasons to have priestly formation separate. And I think it's actually can be harmful to blend lay formation and priestly formation too thoroughly.
Having said that, I mean, obviously I don't know as much as you do about the church, but I've been in Catholic places where these are sort of more modern orders where lay and priestly formation, at least for a while, is shared. Obviously,
right.
there are different things that are done in the end, or at some point, but it is possible, and I think it's quite. I mean, I think I've talked to you, Rusty, about my great, admiration for the Chemin Neuf community, which is a charismatic Catholic but ecumenical order that has vowed celibate men and women, but also married people and families and so on. And everybody goes through the same theological formation for that community for the most part. Some of them get ordained, and then they have other things they do, but the main theological education for that community includes the married couples and the celibate men and women and so on. They have to adjust some things. And I was surprised when I heard that and saw a little of it. But I think there's something special about that. The challenge is great, though, because it's a community. So they make commitments, These are the married members have made a commitment to that community. They've made vows of a certain kind. So it is a little different in that sense. But that goes back to the whole question of whether theological education can be a potpourri of different life places and interests and so on. Well, up to a point, but I think in the end, as you said, it's about the subject matter is God, heart and soul. And those who pursue theological education need to give it all on however that can be done in their conditions of life.
So changing gears a bit, so to this ideal of community theological education that we've talked about at various points, one participant asks, I've been part of a few study groups of intimate sizes in my time, migrating through Baptist, Reformed, Presby, and now Anglican. These study groups don't seem to last very long and stay together consistently. How do we develop sustained and committed groups within traditions or interdenominationally amidst the natural ebb and flow of life stages, and busyness? So I'd be interested to hear, examples of people have been part of more informal, organic, non-institutional contexts that actually throve and took root and lasted, and if so, how does that happen?
My experiences have all been in institutions that were set up to provide that continuity. In other words, 20 years teaching at Creighton University, the institution was the permanent skeleton, so to speak, and the flesh. The cells would die and be renewed as people entered that institution and left.
So I think that gets to the question of, can theological education take place without formal institutions of some kind. And,
Well, shared life. There's
Right.
got to be some sharing of life, not just of books that you read. Not that that can't be something that brings people together, but you don't have to be a member of an order, but you can share a ministry, or you can share a kind of ministry, or you can share a setting of what you're doing. But when you share life, life as a Christian disciple, then the study that you're doing, well, it grabs you. I mean, that's been in my experience. I've been in Bible studies that have lasted for a number of years. And those that have lasted and flourished was because we were part of common ministry. I mean, a kind of ministry. And in one case, it was in inner city, different people doing different things and so on. And we got together regularly, but we knew what we were studying had deep meaning for what we were doing. Not the same way for everybody, but we knew it counted, And I think it's that commitment aspect, but I think commitment comes with giving your life to something together. Have everybody put in $2,000 and you'll show up.
That's a good point. Alan, do you have anything to add?
No, I was just reflecting on my own experiences, and so the Bible studies, this groups that I've been in, they always end when somebody has to move to get a job or for another degree, right? Orvin, said life stages, right? So when children, sometimes that would disrupt things. When a young couple would first have a child, and then we wouldn't see them for a while, and so I've just been sitting here thinking, how much of this, the challenge of consistency and of sharing life, as Ephraim has talked about, is caused by a contemporary way of life where we're so fluid, where we
Right.
don't put down roots, we're liquid, and I don't know what a solution to that is, except, in the first place, acknowledging it. So if we can't acknowledge the point that we have a problem of moving everywhere, of not being committed, then we're not going to be able to solve this problem of study groups that don't stay together.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. It's, part of the reason people are so quick to move is because they don't have communities that they're part of that give them a good reason to stay where they are. But part of the reason those communities never develop is because everyone's already moving. So, if we could once slow down and start putting down roots, then it would be a lot easier to keep slowing down. But there's so much that works against that. I think we have time for, we don't really, but we're gonna ask one more question that I thought was a good one, and now I've lost. Oh, there it is. The conversation has touched on the genealogy of theological education. Thinking a bit further back, how might today's forms of theological education be informed by forms of theological education during the early church and patristic era? I'm thinking particularly of catechetical schools that operated in cultures where Christianity was not in the majority.
I
can report that certainly the Catholic Church here in the United States, pastors, we're waking up to the fact that we have a serious problem. Theological formation, catechetical formation ends with First Communion, and we have no continuing education for adults in the Catholic Church as a normal thing. And this is reached crisis proportions. You have people going to Mass regularly that haven't got the slightest clue about the most basic elements of what the meaning of what the Church teaches. And so I think we'll see a big change in this coming generation, and there will be a big development of Sunday school, which is what a lot of Protestants do very, very well. The grown-ups come, the kids go to Sunday school, mom and dad go to Sunday school, and then you go worship. It's a great model, and it's one that we should be imitating in the Catholic Church.
Just quickly in terms of catechesis, I mean, that's bringing things down to a different set of people in some ways, although the two ought to go together. Any, if you will, professional trained theologian who is not comfortable with and doesn't know how to put together a basic, repeatable catechetical program hasn't learned enough about what they're doing. And I think that's something that ought to be taught in the, if you will, higher level theological education. But I also think it's something that needs to then be applied. At least the Catholic Church has a catechetical program that is standard and is relatively carefully.
People who enter the church as adults.
Yeah, I understand. But all I'm saying is a lot of churches don't have anything for any age level. And having some kind of entryway that's well formed and that become the basis and a further study in a graded way is something we ought to be looking at. One of the problems is that everybody does it their own way, which is okay up to a point, but there would be one of the grand Christian ecumenical moves is to work towards common catechetical teaching at adolescent and young adult and adult ages. And it's precisely because it's not sort of all in the sophisticated levels of this, that, and the other, it ought to be easier to do. It ought to be easier to do. When it was something Cardinal Casper, when he was at the end of his time as head of the promoting Christian unity, he wanted a kind of ecumenical catechetical program that could reflect the kind of solid Christian common commitments that had emerged, that never happened. And maybe because those common commitments hadn't really emerged, I don't know. But
well, thank you. This has been a fantastic discussion. Lots of food for thought. Really appreciate each of your contributions. Thanks to all of our participants for tuning in and for your excellent questions. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the Davenant Institute and our project of seeking to bridge the gap between the church and the academy and bring theological education back into the churches in various forms, please do sign up for our mailing list. And also please check out our Davenant Hall program, which is seeking to do this blend that I talked about a bit in terms of using online instruction for what online instruction can do well, and tying that in with intensive residential community formation at our Davenant House Study Center. So we hope to, this has, I think, been a great success. We hope to do more webinars like this in the future. So please stay tuned. Thanks again so much, Rusty, Ephraim, and Alan. It's been a real pleasure.
thanks to you, Brad. And thanks to all the people who have been listening in.
Yeah.
Bye.